Andrea is going to take us to her project in Center City, Philadelphia.
Okay, am I on? All right. So to start, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you for your time. Thank my thesis chair, Brittany Williams, as well as our fearless thesis coordinator, Carl McQueen, for getting us all to this spot. Place and faith. This thesis is a study of an interfaith center introduced into a mixed-use development. It is a typological test of an interfaith center within our urban fabric, studying the way in which we engage with faith communities in our cities today. So our agenda for today, first we're going to talk about the prompt, 3 trends that prompted this architectural study. Second, we'll talk about interfaith spaces as they exist now, and if they truly encourage the type of dialogue that we need.
I apologize to interrupt. Andrea is a dual degree major in real estate as well as architecture. I apologize for not pointing that out.
Yes. My name is Andrea Nichols. I'm a dual degree candidate for the Masters of Architecture and Real Estate Development. And this is Place and Faith. The third thing we'll talk about is the site, Philadelphia, colloquially known as the city of brotherly love. And fourth, the articulation of the project and the design goals. So the first trend that prompted this architectural study is development and densification within our cities. If you're familiar with the wharf in DC, this is kind of a common thing that I noticed very early on within thesis research, is the development pressure on dwindling mostly church congregations. In DC, a common situation is the congregation is running low on funds and offers to work with developers in order to develop multifamily housing on their site in order to stay active in the community and to continue to exist. This type of development pressure often results in 2 different typologies. The first typology is the house of worship is itself turned into housing, into a profitable use, or the faith-based congregation is willing to downsize and build on a portion of their parcel. And what this does, or what this prompts in architectural study is how we interact with faith in our cities. What does it mean that our congregations are dwindling, and what does that mean for our ever increasingly diverse population? This thesis will propose a third typology, an interfaith center, resulting in a development that interacts with the community. The second trend that prompts this architectural study is our changing faithscape. So we are increasingly becoming an unaffiliated nation. About 24% as of 2016 of Americans identified as unaffiliated with any one institutionalized religion. This is a result of kind of disenchantment with some of these institutionalized religions, as well as sort of the ever splitting identifications, whether that be unaffiliated but still considering themselves religious, considering themselves atheist, agnostic, or a secular individual. And there's also this notion of considering yourself spiritual, and the increasing trends of kind of pop culture inclusion of sort of older spiritual notions like horoscopes, or even the westernization of Eastern meditation practices. There's like meditation apps are very popular today. The third trend that prompts this architectural study is a rather high level of social turmoil in our community. 2017 saw the highest level of religious-based hate crimes since the year following the terrorist attacks in 9/11, at the height of our nation's Islamophobia. However, we do see interfaith organizations acting in communities in order to combat these issues. I really like this cartoon by a cartoonist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, basically encouraging this notion that faith-based organizations oftentimes have a great deal of respect for each other and their role in communities, and this idea that they could stand together in order to promote a better future. All kind of harking back to this idea that ignorance breeds fear, and fear remains the greatest enemy to peace. Second on our agenda, interfaith spaces do exist. However, kind of minimal it might be as an architectural typology or an architectural typology that gets studied. They do exist, and to start with why they exist, you can go back to the World's Columbia exhibition in 1893, our beloved Daniel Burnham's vision for idealism at the height of the City Beautiful movement. In the auxiliary building of that gathering, of that celebration of culture, was the very first gathering of the World Parliament of Religions. Widely known as the first kind of gathering of representatives of Western and Eastern spiritual traditions. The presiding curator of that event, Charles Boney, ended the event saying, "Henceforth, religions of the world will make war, not on each other, but on the evils that afflict mankind." So it's this idea that we have interfaith organizations working in the world, and there's a movement towards peace between religions. Interfaith spaces, as they exist today, oftentimes are found in three different typologies. First, in very small installations within hospitals and airports. So this is commonly kind of a room set aside in an airport that you would head to before traveling, or even in a hospital that you would head to pray for your loved one, or something of that nature. These spaces are oftentimes pretty small and retrofitted as like leftover space in that larger kind of institution. They are more transient as opposed to permanent spaces with a lack of interaction as opposed to the intended dialogue that this thesis will try and explore. This is a direct result of the type of building that they are. Hospitals and airports, you're not there for a long time. You may go spend some time in this space, but you don't have the time to really engage in interesting conversations with the other people in that situation. The second typology that we do see are in universities. Universities are a gathering of open-minded individuals seeking understanding, seeking a greater community dialogue. So in universities, oftentimes an interfaith space will be within another building and is kind of in the in-between between transient and permanent. That population is there for a longer period of time than, of course, in a hospital or an airport, but it's not their permanent place of residence. And we see kind of this balance between lack of interaction and dialogue. Finally, we also have suburban examples of interfaith centers. In the county I grew up in, actually, in Howard County, there are interfaith centers associated with the different villages of that development, in which the place is a very permanent place. It's much larger. It exists for the community as a whole. However, there does seem to be a lack of interaction between the congregations that might use that space. This is a result of the rather homogeneous nature of the community in that area. A lot of times the congregations are established and they don't necessarily actually interact with each other. They may use the space on one day and a different congregation comes in on a different day. So what does this mean? This means that we have existing typologies of interfaith spaces. However, we haven't tested it at a truly urban scale. We've seen it within larger buildings. We've seen it in hospitals and airports. We've seen it within larger sort of bubble developments like universities, and we've seen it in suburban installations. However, we haven't seen it at a pedestrian foot trafficked kind of area like this thesis will propose. So trying to find the most potential for dialogue as well as a closer level of permanence for this space as opposed to transience. So the site, Philadelphia, colloquially known as the City of Brotherly Love, was chosen for this thesis for its development potential. The mixed-use building will include several different uses. The site is located in West Philly on the east bank of the Schuylkill River. Philadelphia is sandwiched between the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River, with development heading out west as the universities of University of Pennsylvania and Drexel continue to be prominent in the area. The city is stitched together by a series of bridges. This is looking back towards Center City from the western expansion and the development happening along with UPenn and Drexel University. And there's our site. An important amenity located near the site is the Schuylkill Riverbanks Park and the Schuylkill Riverbanks Trail, which will be enhanced by this project and provide an already existing desire to be connected to nature, to be connected to the mind, body, and spirit. Standing within the existing site, there's currently an office building as well as a parking lot. These images give you a sense of the contrast in fabric, urban fabric that exists on this site. To the east, there are lower row home developments, and across the river and directly adjacent to our site are high rises and this sort of taller and denser fabric. So to better understand the site, it's important to understand, or to better understand the proposed massing, the proposed design elements. It's important to understand the way in which the topography heads down towards the river, passing underneath the Walnut Street and Chestnut Street bridges, allowing for South 24th Street to pass underneath those bridges. Like mentioned before, existing on our site is an office building and a parking lot currently, and adjacent we have a 35-story high-rise. So how do we mitigate this site? So the first step is to take advantage of something that's an interesting aspect of the site currently. The office high-rise that exists here has a parking garage that you can actually drive and walk onto off of the bridge level, as opposed to entering the lobby from South 24th Street. So the first step for this solution is to create a base, to create a parking garage that includes service functions and auxiliary functions for the building that establishes a new ground plane between the two bridges. In addition to carving out a space for an atrium to access the development from South 24th Street, as well as carving out a space for bioretention to allow for better percolation of water, stormwater runoff into the earth, as opposed to the parking lot that exists there currently. Like mentioned before, this connects the existing pedestrian ways of the Walnut Street and Chestnut Street Bridge, creating a new path that enhances the existing park, Schuylkill Riverbanks Park. So the Interfaith Center, we discussed the different current typologies of interfaith institutions. The main programmatic elements of this proposed Interfaith Center include first, a program space that engages Walnut Street Bridge and the central courtyard, as well as a larger lecture hall that stands out as an object in space from Chestnut Street Bridge, and they are organized around a central courtyard that it has a meditative prayer garden that we'll discuss a little bit later. Moving on with the massing, we have office massing above, as well as the residential lobby, which has amenity spaces such as a fitness center that faces the city and a event room that faces the water. So, as a mixed-use development, Schuylkill Place has 243 units with a good mix of 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, and studio apartments. A potential for 27 office suites with shared kitchens and different typologies available, as well as that ground level interfaith center that acts as the hub for this project. It's serviced by a base and atriums with entrances off of South 24th Street and Walnut Street. So there's a mitigation of the existing topography level of South 24th Street, as well as the new established ground plane of the bridge level. So to go into the design goals of this project, the intent for the Interfaith Center is to act as a new community place to, one, engage and enhance the waterfront as the meditation prayer garden interacts with the path it creates on the new bridge level between Walnut Street and Chestnut Street, as well as providing spaces for important conversation and community gatherings. The main lecture hall, seen here, has the potential for hosting lectures, conferences, and even concerts. In addition, the program and event space that engages Walnut Street has the opportunity to host community meals. A lot of faith-based traditions have a lot of meaning behind meals. The potential is there for Sikh communities to host langar meals, which is a community gathering that is given to anyone who walks in, open to anyone. A breaking of the fast in Islam and iftar could also happen here. Shabbat, as well as a Christmas dinner. A lot of times faith-based traditions have altruistic leanings, so this programmatic space is an opportunity to provide community needs. And lastly, the meditation prayer garden that engages the waterfront as well as the new created path is intended to create a relaxing and spiritual place for all city dwellers. The garden is an opportunity for people in the city to engage with, again, their body, mind, and spirit. Gardening a lot of times and connection to nature is one of the ways that people find their spirituality. So before I open up to comments and questions, I want to just get into a little bit of the thought process behind the meditation prayer garden and that central courtyard and the physicality of prayer. So the leanings of this interfaith space and the only truly sacred space to this program is this courtyard. And what that space does is allow for the individual idea of spirituality as opposed to the collective. It doesn't take a lot of space for a lot of faith-based tradition types of prayer, meditation, seated meditation, or yoga, or even participating in different types of prayer can all happen within this garden. In conclusion, Place and Faith is a thesis that studies the integration of an interfaith center in our urban environment in a new way. Thank you.
I just want to ask, do you have your models? Do you have any models that you want to...
Yes, so I have process models here, as well as the site model. So across the river is that those taller developments that are happening in West Philly. as well as the kind of the great juxtaposition between the fabric to the east.
Could you move that to a
Yes.
second, please? Thank you.
Very center, or like all the way? Okay. So this is my site. I don't actually have a final model. So this is where that massing that you saw earlier would be.
Could I ask you, why did you locate your housing tower?
Where it is.
Why did you locate it towards the inside instead of towards the street, lining up with the other towers that I see in the context?
So the main goal behind that was to allow for the most sunlight to reach this garden. The idea was that the stepping down of the office mass helps allow for that.
But the question was, why didn't you align with the other slab?
Why didn't it go this way? Southern exposure as opposed to this orientation. Is the programmatic elements of the typical residential floor plate allow for more glazing on the southern facade than on the northern facades to mitigate heat loss. The service functions are also pushed to the northern side.
Since this center of this project is a faith issue, how you see the progression of, perhaps your street, I think, as I'm going to assume this as the point that other people will enter the site, as well as how the people leave this place will interfere. Do you see a progression? Do you see this even relevant? Like, how do you basically enter this place?
Yeah, so the idea is that there are a lot of different uses in the building, and so there's a lot of thought as far as like the shared lobby spaces. The main kind of public entrances would be on Walnut Street that engage the program space. The idea is that these meals and events that would happen in this space are more open to the public as opposed to like a planned lecture that might be more private.
I mean, I'm struggling with making this different from a complex that has an auditorium and a courtyard. And trying to set it up in the context of a place that basically somehow promotes not only several faiths, but also the sort of communication between faiths. And I'm having an issue there. Is there anything you can do to help me understand this a little better?
Sure. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. There's a professor in Liverpool, Andrew Compton, who's written a lot about how multi-faith spaces, he has an article that's called Multi-Faith Spaces, God Leaves the Building. Because the idea is that our kind of notion of sacredness is so imbued in symbols and in particular traditions. It's really hard to evoke spirituality with just purely architectural elements without hearkening to one particular faith. So moves that I made in order to inspire spirituality or this idea of interfaith were pretty simple as opposed to enriched in like symbols or anything. Bringing in natural light whenever possible. The auditorium has skylights on both sides. Again, the integration of different elements of nature, reflection pools, as well as gardening beds. So using ideas of natural light as well as nature to inspire the potential for spirituality. These prayer spaces were an idea that I was playing with since the beginning. This idea that I ditched the idea that there would be like a shared chapel space solely because it seemed like what's the word I'm looking for? Like all the sort of traditions of one particular religion that are associated with like a worship service in a larger space for multiple people are a lot of times a barrier of entry for people of other faiths to engage in. So the idea was to prioritize the individual prayer kind of pod as opposed to a community space.
A couple follow-up questions to that comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's a difficult challenge, like just getting my head around what you're trying to do. So one of the things I have two questions which I'll ask at the end, but the first thing I wanted to say is one of the things kind of programmatically that I'm struggling with is like the disconnect of the pieces, and I almost feel like you could have like given one piece of the building over to this, which would have made all this stuff kind of connected in a better way. Like right now, I can go to this kind of lunch cafeteria space, and then I have to like kind of go around to get to the other space. So I can imagine like that kind of short-circuiting some of the way that people would interact. Like maybe there is a Christmas concert associated with a Christmas dinner, which would tie them together. And I get that you could walk across the courtyard, but it's also Philadelphia. It's not, it's not beautiful and nice all the time. And then the other part of it is I'm thinking about auditoriums that are like somewhat spiritual to me, and like one of the ones is the Lincoln Center Jazz Center with like the glass looking out, like the thought of like, so part of me was, I like want to turn your auditorium so it isn't focused, like what is that looking at? It's looking at like a tree in the side of a building. Like I want that to open up and have glass to the water, or do something different, or maybe it's malleable. It could close down and open back up and be more like way more transparent. So then the two questions that kind of tag onto that, just so to help me understand, is can you talk a little bit more about the little pavilions and why they look the way they look, and what you're trying to foster there. And then I'm a little confused about this. What is this space? What's happening there?
Sure. So the first question about the pavilions. The idea behind the pavilions was to get this idea of like shrouding, sort of veiling this idea of a personal prayer space needs to be slightly private. When you're in that garden, the idea was that these wooden trellises, you can see that someone's already kind of reflecting in that space, that you wouldn't go interrupt them. And in addition, they allow for light play from the wooden trellis up top that is, again, this idea that light oftentimes is associated with spirituality. And there's also simple geometry to the plan of them. The idea of a circle inscribed within a square. Circles don't necessarily have an axis. There's so much like religious connotation to the orientation of things. So the notion that you could enter from any of the four sides and pass through and be oriented to whichever direction you need it to be for your thought, for your prayer.
I'm gonna cut you off for 1 second. And then I'll just hand this to someone else before I keep talking. But I just think that those, like, one, can they move? Can they change? Can they open up and close? Can they move out of the way so you can use the? I mean, I can imagine things happening in the courtyard which would need more space than that. So that, like, they're interesting, and I think maybe they could move, or they could be a different place, or they could change somehow.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a great idea. I mean, there's a lot that's possible for that space. As they're designed currently, they're like permanent installations, but I think that if they were some sort of like movable module, it would be also a nice study.
I don't know if this is the source of it, but I'm also struggling, and I think part of it is the clarity of the problem you're trying to solve and how it's manifesting itself. You talked a lot about the focus on the individual worship. The irony to me in that is that most faiths are not about the individual. That's number one. They're actually about the collective and the communal engagement. Number two is, I agree with you, it's very hard to disassociate yourself from fundamental meanings in orientation, right? Whether you pray to the east or so forth. But I was curious, one of our earlier, the morning's thesis started out with a lot of engagement. Did you happen to talk to representatives of the various predominant faiths that you mentioned? Did you look at church axes and temples and mosques and so forth to study that and find, because to me what this seemed is like a collection of multi-use spaces basically, and the hope that by creating the multi-use space people will somehow matriculate and interact. And I think it might be, I think you need to define whether you're trying to create a facility that has areas that can accommodate the fundamental practices and tasks of each of the predominant faiths, and then it becomes multi-faith in the sense that you've accommodated them, but each one has its own unique identity. Or are you really trying, as you said, to maybe break down barriers and facilitate conversation among the faiths? And that might be something very different. You know, there's a new school of public policy that's coming here, and I'm sure that'll be a hot topic as well there. But, you know, are you trying to create debate spaces, essentially, or discussion spaces, I would call it? Is that your intent? And then have areas of meditation. I think you need to be clear about that and maybe go back to the beginning. But could you answer some of the questions if you did kind of study those iconographies, discuss with those people, and how that informed it? Because I'm not really seeing it here. I apologize.
Sure. No, I think so. To answer the second part of that question, number 2. So creating spaces for dialogue and potential debate. I think, so to touch on the first part of the question, this thesis was in part inspired by my own experiences. Since my freshman year of college, I think, I grew up in a church congregation, and we've gone on what we've called like an interfaith trip to Philly. We know a guy who works for Interfaith Philadelphia. It's a nonprofit in Philly that encourages interaction between faiths, and you don't know your biases until you're confronted with them. You don't know what you don't know until you're there. And so this thesis was inspired by the types of conversations that we had, and the just generally like curiosity that people can have for different worldviews, for your own understanding of everything. And so yeah, the idea was inspired mostly by those conversations as opposed to the spaces, with kind of a hint of every faith-based organization. Like we went to the Sikh Society of Philadelphia. It's a huge community of Sikhs in northeastern Philly. We worship with a Hindu congregation, lots of different congregations, and every time you engage with people, what it comes down to is that they do care about the community. It's like every religion wants to gather, wants to talk with people, wants to help each other out. And so that's part of the inspiration behind the program space is harnessing like every institutionalized religion desire to like care for the greater humanity in this shared space. So it's sort of like a team up space. That's the thought behind that.
So, and it's interesting that you say that because in the beginning, you started talking about how to increase the population of people who are becoming more religious. So how do you get people to become more interested in different types of faiths and to maybe even not, you were showing the percentages of sort of people who don't practice any type of religion. And so one of the things that I think makes, there's an accessibility and being surrounded by different faiths and making it feel like it's welcoming to go and just experience different types of faith. And so when you talk about the community, I keep feeling like maybe there should be some sort of community center aspect of this. Because if people were coming, say bringing their kids to the community center for a little library reading or something like that, maybe then they would see and be able to look at a lot of different ways that different faiths are experiencing the space and are practicing their different types of religions. So I wonder if there's a component to that, especially since you're saying that that's sort of something that's collective, that would help to maybe tie some of the other very separate at this point spaces together. I mean, we've looked at, even in the last presentation that we saw before the break, the connections across the space visually, the axes and cross axes, those types of things, you know, when you're saying you're searching for things in terms of icons or in terms of ways to call out that this is a religious space, those types of elements I think are lost in this project, and those are very basic architectural elements that we can be practicing. So I completely agree with Alec about the theater space. You're on the water. We have very little connection to the water. I mean, there's a fire stair on the water here, and then there's a courtyard outside of it, or there's a plaza outside of it. That seems totally lost. And then you have some of these beautiful sketches. So these sketches up there and those over there with the curved archways and a lot of the sort of sectional relationships that I feel like we're not seeing, are kind of lost in maybe the final product. So can you talk a little bit more about some of these little sketches up here and some of the sort of covered porticos and things like that, the kind of top left?
Sure. I mean, the sketches up here are all kind of iterations of the simple geometry that could be that prayer pavilion.
Okay.
Are you referring to?
So those up there are other schemes for the prayer pavilion.
Yeah.
Interesting. Inside of the main garden, inside of the courtyard.
Yes.
So you looked at one point at sort of taking that articulated archway and almost pulling it across in these smaller elements, or?
Yeah, there was a lot of push and pull between whether or not this should be like symmetrical, how many of them do you have, like, are they like, is it an archway, the path that like lines? There's honestly endless possibilities for that. Those.
Just start talking, Peter.
Ended up here. So, you know, I always struggle with projects that show a building posterized on a site without more context and understanding how it fits into the fabric of the edge. You know, it's an edge site, river opportunity on one side, and there's a street and buildings that line the street on the other side, and I get no connection. So I don't know how this relates to anything. So there's a postage, 2 postage stamps that are connected with some sort of lower element there, and how does it relate to anything else? So I see as an example on Saint-Saëns, the edge of your building runs with the curb across the street. Is there any intention of making connection across there, doing something that ties back into the character of the city? Walnut Street, you've held back. Why did you do that from what's a natural street edge and pretty strong urban edge there? So I can't tell. I can't at the end of the day critique this building as it sits in an urban fabric, and it's an urban building. It appears, I wish there were organizational diagrams that helped us understand why you did things the way you did, what the relationships of the various parts and pieces are. Then we probably could have answered some of the other questions. Again, it's more like it's posterized. It's not really integrated. So.
Just a few comments that relate the idea of the content of the programming and the form of the project and how you arrived at some of the configurations. I think one of the first comment just about the quantity of housing units and the relationship to the street grid and light. Like I'm looking at the plans of all the way up to the 26th floor, right? And you've got a slab building oriented east-west, and so you might look at how you're configuring the units internally, because the south, I'm going to want to live on the south side and not lease or rent the north side. It might beg a different kind of unit deployment on the floor or a different orientation for the slab so that the east-facing units get morning light and the west-facing units get afternoon light. Then I think a lot of the comments in the discussion are about kind of the imageability or the figure, the architectural figure of the shared space, and whether that space is truly shared or individual. And so I'm thinking of things like the MIT chapel. You know, you showed some of the chapels, and there's this place in Helsinki, this Chapel of Silence, which is truly an interfaith kind of non-denominational space. And it's those figures are very different than the urban fabric around them. And then I think Colleen's question about just is there an opportunity, I think, to push the courtyard idea further and make a connection down to those paths that are in the park next to the lake. So I'm looking at the east-west section there, and it looks like it's a fairly, 2 or 3 story at most drop. But was there an opportunity to make a public kind of connection down to that park? Are those rails active?
Yeah.
In the plan?
Yeah. So there are existing sidewalk infrastructure that brings you down over the rails. The sidewalk leads to a stairway on both sides, actually. The rail line is like a Class A CSX rail line that sees a lot of freight cargo traffic.
Okay.
So at one point, we did talk about a solution that would engage the park even further, so challenging that rail line. Ultimately, from a regulatory process and the sort of development side, it was a step too dramatic, I think, was the decision.
It's here in this section. This is on the trains. I mean, it'd be helpful to have the trains in here. This is cut through that, right?
Yes.
So is this all parking?
Yes. So there's a collection of 3 parking levels. The topography slopes down so you enter on the second garage level, and there's mostly just service functions. Philadelphia does have a overlay zone in this area in which parking garages that face a street need to have retail. So down on the bottom level, there's an opportunity to have sort of smaller outfits of retail.
You didn't mention anything about your underground areas, and to me, when I start seeing this project, I thought there was going to be something really important there, because it's clearly not just parking, right?
It is.
Is it just parking?
Yeah.
It doesn't, honestly, it doesn't look like parking. You see how, I mean, out of what I see in your section, that's probably one of the most interesting spaces I see there, because of the changes of labels and everything. And I thought, I mean, clearly, let's be honest. I mean, this was never an easy problem. Never. You got yourself into something that was difficult from the very beginning. I probably wouldn't have dared to step on this thing because it's a difficult thing. So I acknowledge that bravery of yours. You're actually connected with this idea. You have lived it in a way that I have not. And I believe that I understand when you're saying that the best way to actually connect faiths with not be in their respective spaces, but actually, I believe that. I just don't see that the spaces that you're offering us right now, architecturally speaking, talk about that. And it's difficult not to think about everything that architecturally is associated to any of these faiths, so as to think, okay, how would I do something that actually, you know, I don't want to say involve because it doesn't involve all of them, but somehow let me move to different places, more horizontal planes where everyone would have a conversation. But I do think that there is, like, just looking again at your plan and a lot of what has been said, that there was a great opportunity in the effort that you're doing and what you describe as that sort of courtyard that you have. That makes me think, you know, that gesture was the important thing. And there's a number of things that I think could have actually been put geared towards helping that. So if just to think that perhaps that auditorium would have been the head of that space instead of being on one side, being where I don't even know what's going on there. But I do know that it seems like a very potentially interesting place to place this thing facing that, and then everything that is being said of crossing the river would have been the things that I would have expected to see, where I would just leave behind my representation of my faith and say, yes, this will work for me. And I'm missing that. That's what I'm saying. Okay?
Yeah, I think it's struggling with, like, what program to put into the building was a huge hurdle. The sort of suburban examples of interfaith spaces that I showed, they have essentially rooms that are meant to be multi-purpose, like any congregation could come in and use them, so no fixed seating in order for prayer that involves being on the floor or whatnot. And so the non-inclusion of like those types of spaces that are meant to be like shared sort of worship spaces was a hard choice to make, prioritizing sort of this individual prayer with this more community-based programmatic elements. I think you're right. I think there's a hierarchy missing in the program elements of that bridge level. Some sort of a stronger moment with the auditorium might have been more successful.
And then be careful about imagery, you know, because you say you're trying not to use it, but there's no way I'm not going to connect this with some of the cultures that you're having here. So there are some elements. I find it like a very difficult topic to use. I have no idea how I would have approached this, to be honest, if I were you.
There's some elements, like, and you talked about light as being one that's very central. I mean, I could see you starting this with like just charcoal sketches of how is there different ways of light play. You know, you could have presented this whole thing in just black and white with like light play, and just said there's 3 beautiful spaces. They're very different. They each have a different scale. One relates to the water. One relates to the courtyard. One relates to food. You know, and
Yeah,
but
that's great.
yeah, I'm struggling with the relationship to the water, because I feel like you could have sort of dug some of those theaters down, had like a clear story so people could look in and observe but not be part of it until they're ready. You know, almost like these sort of threshold spaces that would allow people to get more comfortable.
I just want to tag on to that. I think one of the interesting things is, like, there's certain things like iconography that you have to throw out because it's so referential. But there's also things that, like, if you had done like showed us like a survey of the things that are common, you know, the commonalities, and that idea of light and the idea of like the kind of ritual, like, I think the thing for me that I'm missing is like the procession, the idea that this thing is ritual in some way, and that even this creation of the attempt to create community has to be ritual, that it has to be ritualized. And you know, that part of it, I think, could have been stronger. And this idea of the relationship to the water might have, and the layers of kind of public to private to individual versus community, like those kinds of layers, and could have tied into all that. So, yeah,
For sure.
it is definitely a challenging proposition, which is what a thesis, I guess, should be. Although maybe it's too hard. It's too hard.
I mean, I think you're trying to tackle a super complex age-old topic, and it's reminding me of a Kojo Namni hosted an NPR show where he was talking about in DC, the fastest shrinking use or program in DC is like church space or religious space. And the phenomenon in DC is that churches are grouping together, they're just taking one of the buildings and they're sharing it. And he was interviewing different denominations and what it meant to share a building that looks like a Presbyterian church. And it was really interesting to hear the conversation. And as an architect, it was humbling because I realized to them it didn't really matter, you know, that there were like 5 denominations in a church that was Episcopal, you know, and that they had generously found a way to like adapt it and add their piece to it so that it became this kind of collage of interior. So I think this is an interesting conversation where on one end of the continuum you have this very sparse black and white, no referential kind of architecture. On the other end, you just kind of use a building or you use a language and you say, that's okay, we're choosing this, and there isn't so much weight on which one dominates. And I know that's complex too, but I just wanted to offer that in the conversation as a kind of like real-time example of what's happening. And I think it's great that you as a real estate student are focusing on this particular use because it is an issue in DC. You know, it's dying. You already have your microphone.
Well, just to respond to Jana, in a way it's analogous to the black box theater versus a thrust theater or proscenium, you know, and so here we see an auditorium that's got a very distinct form, and the black box theater, you can have unidirectional seating, you can have no seating, and so I think there's a need for something like that that's truly kind of, in one sense, kind of got this blank status, but that is also something that can be, that an assemblage of people can project their way of gathering onto it.
But does it need to be blank for people to project?
I don't know.
I think that's the question. It's like, it's hard, it's impossible to separate architecture from like tradition and from culture, and so faith places are in, like, the faith architecture is an embodiment of those traditions, and so the question is there a universal form that could be this opportunity to project? And I think that's what I was getting at. So
I mean, well, the architectural column was actually trying to explore that, because if it's already happening in any kind of space, then there was no problem in terms of how it happens. So to me, taking over the problem will be, you know, is there a better way in which this could happen? And then I imagine that all the rest, like the offices and is just your real estate side of making it feasible, right?
yes and no.
Because it makes it a little even more complicated, you know that. That's
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, at the beginning I was like, what am I doing? Because it's not necessarily typical, nor has it maybe been done before. So very challenging, yes. But I think that what the mixed-use development brings to it is an inherent combination of people, activity, and it was a direct response to the typology and the formal typology that results nowadays, meaning in DC, the sort of typology is two separate buildings. So the church sells a portion of its land and is willing to say okay, you're over there, we're over here. So the challenge is, can you merge formally, architectural mass-wise and whatnot? So that was part of the problem as well.
Have you seen that? I'm not saying this is a good example, but there's a building right next to the MLK library where there's actually a populated village building, church inside a commercial building.
Inside, that's all.
Is it Clarendon, or is that, that's a
It's
different?
right across the street from the MLK library.
It's on the same block, it's
on the
next
same
to
block.
it, it's literally next to it.
Yeah, it's being
I
awfully
don't
developed.
think I've seen that.
It's very different than what you're saying, because
Uh-huh.
it's a commercial, it's an office building,
Uh-huh.
and it's a dedicated, this church is a specific congregation. So it's very different, but it is.
It's a
somewhat
counterpart
absorbed
to
It's
into
an
it.
object that's placed underneath the office.
Yeah.
building.
Definitely worth going to look at and
So-
see, it's beautiful.
I mean, that's one clear example. The oldest one, the oldest modern one, I think, is in New York, where they elevated the office building on stilts and tucked the church back underneath. I mean, so that, this is not new ground in a lot of respects.
You're right.
At the end of the day, from a real estate perspective, the housing pays for the interfaith spaces. So, that's your drive, that's your economic driver. It's paying for all the stuff on the below level, and that's what the churches are doing. They're monetizing their land.
Right, yeah. Because there's a lot of, they're sitting on large parcels in like densify densifying areas.
So I want to thank Andrea for bringing us this conversation. She has grappled with all of the topics that we've been talking about for the past year, and I think that she's really thankful that this is the direction that the conversation went in, that we got into these issues about what does spirituality look like architecturally, and what are how do you divorce architecture from different iconography and things like that. And so I think that this has been a really great discussion. We knew no matter what you presented, it would be a lightning rod for this sort of thing. So it's been really exciting to hear the conversation. I also just want to talk a little bit about what a pleasure it's been to work with you for the past year. If you look at the energy and passion and thoughtfulness that you can look at all of these little sketches that Andrea did, her process is fantastic and really fun to engage with. It's very clear that she's thinking through making and talking and speaking, and so it's been a fun thing to be a part of. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.